The sky above the Dakota plains shimmered like heated glass, the sun hanging heavy over a land that had forgotten mercy. The earth cracked beneath the boots of men who came to watch what they called an auction of compassion, though everyone knew there was nothing kind about it. In the center of the square stood a wooden platform, rough and splintered, where women and children waited to be claimed like cattle. Behind them, wagons rattled, horses snorted, and the low murmur of voices swelled like flies over a carcass. The smell of dust and sweat filled the air, thick enough to choke on. Among the small cluster of broken souls stood Clara Belle, her hands resting protectively on the shoulders of her children. Her belly was round beneath her faded blue dress, the fabric stretched thin over the life growing inside her. Eli, her 8-year-old son, stood stiff and quiet, jaw clenched as he tried to look older than he was. Beside him, Maisie held a frayed doll to her chest, her thumb pressed to her lips, her wide brown eyes darting nervously across the crowd. Clara whispered, "Stand tall, my loves. Don't let them see fear." Her voice trembled, but she forced it steady. She had learned long ago that pride was the only shield left when everything else had been stripped away. Her husband, Thomas, had died beneath a wagon wheel 2 months back, leaving her with debts she couldn't read, a farm she couldn't save, and a baby she couldn't stop from coming. The neighbors had turned away, too busy with their own hunger and drought. The bank had taken the land, and now, with nowhere else to go, Clara had been brought here, offered up like a burden for any man willing to feed her until she gave birth. The sheriff, his hat tilted back and a handkerchief wiping sweat from his neck, climbed the steps of the platform and raised his voice above the noise. "Next up, lot number 6. Widow Belle and her 2 young ones. Good worker, good cook, decent manners. Strong enough for house and field work." His tone was practiced, hollow, like someone reading a grocery list. Clara's stomach twisted. The words, lot number 6, burned in her ears. That was what she'd become, numbers, property, a trade for men who wanted labor or company, not people. She kept her chin high, though her throat ached with shame. $2 a week, a voice called from the back. The crowd shifted. The voice belonged to Harlan Tate, a heavy-set man in a gray vest whose grin made her skin crawl. His eyes slid over her like he was inspecting a horse's haunches. "She can work my kitchen. Kids can sleep in the barn." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Eli stiffened, his small hand tightening around hers. Clara's heart pounded. She knew Harlan Tate's reputation, his temper, his drink, the bruises left on his last housemaid who'd vanished without goodbye. But she also knew no one else would offer more. The sheriff nodded and opened his mouth to finalize the bid. $3, came a low voice, clear and calm, cutting through the noise like a blade. Every head turned. A tall man stood near the fence, his hat pulled low, his coat dusty from the trail. He leaned against a post, one boot crossed over the other, a cigarette burning between his fingers. His face was weathered, his eyes pale and unreadable beneath the brim. A thin scar ran across his left brow, a white mark that caught the light when he moved. It was Jack Coulter. The name passed in murmurs through the crowd. Folks said he'd fought in the war, came home with a limp and a ghost he never talked about. Lived alone out near Red Creek, miles from town, working cattle and talking to no one. A man who carried his loneliness the way others carried guns, always close, always ready. $3, he repeated, flicking his cigarette. Aside, and they get a roof. Food. No one lays a hand on them. The sheriff hesitated, glancing toward Tate. Any counter? Tate's face turned red. You don't even need a woman, Coulter. You ain't right in the head since the war. Jack's eyes lifted slowly. You gonna outbid me, Harlan, or keep wastin' air? A low chuckle rippled through the crowd, and Tate spat in the dirt. Keep her, then. She ain't worth the trouble. The sheriff's gavel struck the platform. Sold. Widow Belle and family to Jack Coulter. The sound of it echoed like a gunshot. Clara's breath caught. The crowd began to drift, leaving whispers and stares in their wake. She turned to face the man who had just changed her life with a few quiet words. Her hands trembled as she stepped closer, Eli clinging to her side. You don't know what you're buying into, she said softly, her voice almost drowned by the rustle of the wind. I've got 2 children and another on the way. I can't offer you anything but work and worry. You may regret this. Jack looked at her without a trace of pity. His gaze was steady, calm. Ma'am, he said, his voice deep and rough, I've been living with regret most of my life. Don't reckon this'll add to it. He tipped his hat, then turned to help the children climb into his wagon. His hands were calloused but gentle when he lifted Maisie, who hid her face in his chest. Eli followed, watching him warily. When he offered his hand to Clara, she hesitated only a second before taking it. His grip was firm, warm, and for some reason she couldn't name, she didn't feel afraid. They rode in silence as the sun dipped low over the plains. The sky turned to copper, then to bruised purple, the horizon stretching endless and lonely. The wagon creaked, the horses' hooves beat a slow rhythm against the hard earth. Every now and then, Jack would glance toward her, as if to make sure she was still there, still real. "You got anyone left?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "No one. My folks passed years back. Thomas's kin moved east." He nodded, saying nothing more. When they reached his ranch, night had fallen. The land opened wide before her, a small cabin nestled by a line of cottonwoods, a barn leaning slightly with age, a corral fence that looked half-mended. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd hoped for. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, carrying the smell of pine and ash. Jack jumped down and helped the children inside. "You'll sleep in the bed," he said, setting her bags near the hearth. "Kids can take the loft. I'll stay out here by the stove." She frowned. "That's not necessary." He shrugged. "Ain't much else to argue about. You're the one needs rest." Later that night, Clara sat by the fire after putting the children to bed. Jack was outside, fixing a broken section of fence by lantern light. She watched him through the window, the steady rhythm of his movements, the patience in his hands. He wasn't a man used to talking, she realized. He worked like someone who needed purpose to keep from thinking too much. When he finally came in, he didn't meet her eyes. He nodded once, removed his hat, and settled onto the floor by the stove, his dog curling up beside him. The only sound was the soft crackle of firewood. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For not treating us like property." He gave a small, almost embarrassed shrug. "Didn't do it for thanks, ma'am. Just seemed wrong to leave you there." She studied his face in the firelight, the hard lines softened by exhaustion, the flicker of something behind his eyes that looked a lot like sorrow. She wanted to ask him what he'd lost, what haunted him, but she didn't. Instead, she whispered, "Good night, Mr. Coulter." He tipped his head in silent reply. That night, as wind sighed through the cracks of the old cabin, Clara lay awake listening to the steady breathing of her children above and the faint creak of the floorboards where the cowboy slept. For the first time in months, the fear in her chest loosened just enough to let her breathe. She didn't know what kind of man he truly was or what kind of life awaited them, but she knew one thing: the stranger who'd bought her freedom tonight was not the kind to do it for selfish gain. And as the firelight dimmed, her last thought before sleep was that maybe, just maybe, Mercy had found her after all. The days that followed slipped quietly into a rhythm neither of them expected. The mornings began with the soft sound of the rooster crowing across the open fields, followed by the smell of coffee drifting through the small cabin. Clara would rise before the sun, moving carefully so as not to wake the children. Her belly had grown heavier, slowing her steps, but she refused to sit idle. There was always work to do: baking bread, scrubbing floors, sewing the tears in worn shirts, or tending to the small patch of vegetables behind the house. Jack had offered to hire help from town, but she'd shaken her head. She'd had enough of people taking things from her. She needed to feel useful again. Jack kept to his chores, silent as ever. He fixed fences, trained horses, and rode out to the pastures each day. But every evening, he'd return before sunset and wash his hands at the pump before sitting down for supper. The first few nights were awkward, no one spoke much. Eli glared at him suspiciously, Maisie barely touched her food, and Clara felt the weight of unspoken things pressing on her chest. But gradually, the silence softened. It started one night when Jack told Maisie that her stew was the best he'd ever had. Her eyes lit up, and she laughed, a small, bright sound that filled the dim kitchen. Eli began asking questions about horses, and Jack answered patiently, teaching him how to brush a mane or feed a mare without spooking her. By the end of the week, Eli was following him everywhere, his earlier distrust replaced by a shy admiration he tried to hide. Clara watched all of it quietly. She saw the way Jack's face changed when he was around the children, the way the corners of his mouth lifted ever so slightly, the way his eyes softened. There was gentleness in him, hidden beneath layers of solitude and loss. She didn't know what ghosts lived behind his silence, but she could tell they weren't cruel ones. One afternoon, while hanging laundry on the line, she saw him across the field breaking in a wild horse. The animal fought hard, kicking and thrashing, but Jack held steady, his body moving with the rhythm of its defiance. She found herself watching longer than she should have, her heart beating faster for reasons she couldn't name. When he finally caught her staring, she looked away quickly, cheeks burning, and pretended to fuss with a clothespin. Later that evening, as he came in with dust on his boots and a sheen of sweat on his brow, she handed him a cup of water. Their fingers brushed, and she felt something sharp and electric run through her. He looked at her, then down at the cup, as if unsure what to do with the feeling that had suddenly filled the space between them. "Thank you, ma'am," he murmured, voice rough. "Call me Clara," she said softly. He hesitated, then nodded. "Clara," he repeated, the sound of her name unfamiliar on his tongue. She didn't realize until later how deeply she'd wanted to hear it. The weeks grew colder, the air crisp and sharp with the coming of winter. The leaves turned brittle, and frost kissed the ground each morning. Clara's belly swelled heavier, and her steps slowed. Jack started taking over her chores without asking, chopping firewood, carrying water, even mending a few seams when she was too tired. When she scolded him for it, he just gave that quiet shrug of his. "You done enough," he'd say. "Ain't no harm in me helpin'." One evening, dark clouds gathered fast over the prairie, and a storm came down with sudden violence. Rain lashed the windows, and thunder cracked like cannon fire. Jack had gone out earlier to bring in the cattle, and Clara stood by the door, wringing her hands as the lightning lit up the sky. Hours passed, and she could barely see through the downpour. Just when fear began to twist her stomach, she saw him, riding back through the storm, soaked to the bone, guiding the last straggling calf into the pen. When he stumbled into the house, dripping and cold, she grabbed a towel and pushed it into his hands. "You'll catch your death out there," she scolded. He gave a faint grin, teeth chattering. Cows didn't much care about the weather. She shook her head, half angry, half relieved, and took his coat from him, hanging it near the fire. He stood there for a moment, watching her in the flickering light. "You're kind," he said quietly. "Didn't figure I'd have that again." Clara didn't know what to say. She turned back to the stove, hiding the warmth that spread in her chest. It was after that night that everything began to change. He started joining her on the porch after supper, both of them sitting in the silence that stretched wide and comfortable as the plains. Sometimes they talked about small things, the weather, the cattle, the baby coming. Other times they didn't speak at all, and that, somehow, felt even better. But trouble has a way of finding peace. Word began to spread through town that Harlan Tate hadn't taken kindly to being made a fool of at the auction. He'd been drinking more, and his bitterness had turned to talk. "Coulter's playin' hero for a widow," men whispered at the saloon. "Reckon he needs teachin' a lesson." Clara heard the rumors from the peddler who came by one morning. Her hands shook as she set down the jar of flour he'd sold her. That evening, she told Jack, her voice low and tight with fear. "He's angry, Jack. He said he'd come for me." Jack didn't flinch. He finished stacking the logs by the door, then turned to her. "He comes here, he won't leave happy. I promise you that. You can't fight him," she whispered. "There are men who'll stand with him. I've fought worse things than men," he said simply. "I won't let him take what's safe here." She wanted to argue, but the calm in his eyes stopped her. There was something immovable about Jack Coulter, like the land itself, scarred, stubborn, and unyielding. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the wind batter the cabin, the steady creak of wood, and Jack's footsteps pacing outside. Every few minutes she'd hear him stop, listening to the dark, his rifle always within reach. And even in her fear, a strange sense of safety settled over her. He was watching over them. No one had ever done that before. The next morning came pale and cold, the horizon washed in silver light. Jack came in from the porch, his face drawn but calm. He poured himself a cup of coffee, and when she handed him a biscuit, their fingers brushed again. This time, neither of them looked away. "You should rest," he said quietly. "So should you," she replied. He gave a faint smile. "I'll rest when there's nothing left to worry about." By the week's end, Tate did come, 3 riders in the night, their horses snorting and stamping at the gate. The children woke to the shouting, Eli rushing to the window before Clara could stop him. She heard the clatter of boots outside, Jack's voice low and sharp as he told them to leave. "What's she to you?" Tate shouted through the dark. "You think a broken woman's gonna fix what's dead in you?" There was the sound of a rifle cocking, then Jack's voice, steady as the wind. "She's not yours to speak of. You best turn that horse around. You wouldn't shoot, Tate sneered. Try me. A tense silence followed, broken only by the restless stamping of horses. Then the men turned and rode off into the black prairie. Clara pressed her hand over her heart, trembling, as the door creaked open and Jack stepped inside, his jaw tight. She met him halfway across the room, tears spilling before she could stop them. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered. He'll come back, maybe, Jack said, wiping rain from his brow. But he won't come easy next time. She hesitated, then reached up, her hand resting against his arm. Why do you care so much? He looked at her, the answer slow and quiet. Because once, I needed someone to care, and no one did. You don't leave folks to the wolves, Clara. Not while I've got breath. The room felt suddenly smaller, filled with the sound of their hearts instead of the storm outside. She took a step closer, her voice barely a whisper. You won't always have to be alone, Jack. He blinked, his throat working as though words wanted to come but couldn't. Instead, he just nodded, once, and walked to the window to keep watch until dawn. A month later, the first snow fell, blanketing the prairie in white. The cabin was warm, the fire steady. Clara went into labor that night, and when the baby's cry filled the room, Jack stood frozen by the door, eyes wide. She held the child close, exhausted but smiling through tears. Would you hold him? She asked softly. Jack hesitated, then reached out. The tiny bundle fit awkwardly in his calloused hands, and when he looked down, his breath caught. He's got your eyes, she whispered. Jack's voice cracked when he answered, Guess I don't regret a damn thing, Clara. And though neither said the word aloud, something in that small cabin had already begun to sound like love.